Snow pressed against the glass like a white hand trying to hush the world. Inside the small cabin, Helen Mae Dawson fed another log to the fire. She watched the sparks curl up the chimney like restless souls. She was used to the silence of winter, but it never stopped feeling heavy. Silence could be crueler than any voice. In it, she heard the echoes of all the things the town said about her. Cursed, wild, unfit to marry, unfit to belong. Even the crackle of the fire seemed to whisper those words when the night deepened and the wind screamed over the ridge. She was 28 now, beautiful in a way the town called dangerous. Her hair fell in loose, untamed waves. Her eyes were too sharp for men who wanted softness. It had been years since she'd lived with another soul, years since her mother's grave had vanished under the same drifts now piling against her door. Solitude had become her only company. Sometimes she wore it like a shawl, other times like chains. The snowstorm rose fierce by evening, blotting out the black trees that clung to the valley. Helen set her lantern on the sill, more out of habit than hope. Few traveled this way in such weather. She wrapped herself in a faded quilt and settled near the fire. Her fingers, cracked from chopping wood, ached. She wondered if spring would ever feel warm enough to reach her bones. Then came the sound, a thud at first, muffled by the wind. She stiffened, the air in her chest locking. Another thud, heavier, the unmistakable rhythm of a hand against her door. No one knocked here. Travelers passed on toward town or perished in the snow long before. Helen rose slowly. Every step through her narrow cabin creaked with hesitation. Her hand touched the latch, cold against her skin. She pulled the door open into a blizzard of white. Two figures stood there, monumental against the storm. The first was a man, young and broad-shouldered, tall as though the sky had shaped him differently. Snow streaked his dark hair and clung to the bare muscles of his chest. His cloak hung open, as if he cared nothing for the cold. His skin was copper and marked with scars. He carried the proud bearing of an Apache warrior. Beside him leaned an older man, white-haired, his back bent, but his eyes sharp. He clutched a staff for balance, his breath ragged from the climb. "Can we stay one night?" The younger man's voice was low, calm, carrying the weight of a request that was not a plea. Helen's heart hammered. The warnings of the town folk rang in her ears. Apaches bring only ruin. But the old man looked so tired he seemed carved from ice, and the younger's eyes, dark and unblinking, were not cruel. They were patient. They were waiting for her judgment. For one breath, she thought of shutting the door. For another, she thought of how empty the cabin had felt for so many years. She stepped aside. The younger man guided his father in first. He brushed the snow from the old man's shoulders and helped him toward the fire. Helen caught the faint smell of pine smoke clinging to their clothes, and beneath it, something wilder, earth and horse and storm. They did not thank her with words, but the silence they carried felt like respect, not entitlement. She knelt by the hearth, adding wood. The firelight threw gold across the young man's torso. Scars traced his skin like maps of old battles. His breath fogged the air, but he did not shiver. Helen tried not to stare. She tried not to remember how long it had been since she had seen another's strength up close. The old man pressed his palms toward the flames, his thin fingers trembling. "You'll need blankets," Helen said, her voice cracking from disuse. She fetched her patched quilts, smelling of cedar, and laid them near the stranger's father. The old man's eyes met hers for a moment, and she felt something pass between them. Recognition, perhaps. The look of two people long acquainted with loneliness. As the storm deepened, the cabin filled with a new kind of silence. Not the hollow quiet of her solitude, but the hush of watchfulness. The young Apache sat cross-legged near the fire, sharpening a small knife with a stone. The steady rasp echoed through the room, strangely soothing. Helen busied herself with boiling water, slicing what roots and dried meat she had. She placed the pot over the fire, and the rising steam softened the air. "You've lived here long." The words startled her. The young man spoke without looking up. "Long enough," she answered, then fell silent. He nodded, as if the brevity of her reply was all he needed. That small courtesy unsettled her. Men in town demanded stories, explanations, proofs. This one accepted what was given. The old man dozed by the hearth, his breathing deepening. Helen served them bowls of stew. The younger man ate slowly, offering half his portion back to his father without hesitation. That gesture pierced her in a way she could not name. She remembered how no one had shared with her when she starved after her family's loss, how even neighbors had turned their backs. When the bowls were empty, Helen spread another quilt over the old man's shoulders. Her fingers brushed his weathered hand. His eyes opened, and he whispered a word she did not know. It sounded like, "Daughter." Later, when both men slept, Helen sat alone in her chair. Snow still roared outside, but the silence inside had changed. It no longer pressed down like a stone. It held a faint hum, the presence of other lives breathing near hers. She studied the younger man's face in sleep. The hard lines had softened, and for the first time in years, she wondered if loneliness was her only fate. The wind slammed against the cabin, a reminder of danger, of the town's warnings, of how easily kindness could ruin a woman already judged. She pulled the quilt tighter, staring at the door, half expecting more knocks to come. Her world had shifted the moment she opened that door. She whispered into the quiet, as if confessing to the storm. Nothing will be the same now. And she was right. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly see in the flickering firelight, was that the old man wasn't just sick from the cold, he was dying from something far worse. Morning came pale and brittle. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried in silence. Helen found the two strangers still in her home. The old man, White Feather, slept by the hearth. The younger, whose name she learned was Newell, was already awake, mending a strap with deft fingers. He looked up only once, a glance as quick as a hawk's, then returned to his task. Helen opened the door to the hard brilliance of the morning. She knew she couldn't keep them hidden. Her cabin was a subject of curiosity. If neighbors caught sight of Apaches within, the whispers would turn into a storm fiercer than any blizzard. But something stronger than caution urged her to help. The old man needed medicine. That meant the town. By the time they reached the rutted path, Helen's pulse was a hard knot in her throat. Newell walked at her side, his father supported gently between them. The sight of the three of them together felt like a painting from a world that shouldn't exist. Conversation stilled as soon as they set foot on the main street. Men straightened from their work. Women clutched their shawls closer. The hush was the intake of breath before a judgment falls. Martha Kellum was first. Her mouth, always quick with rumor, twitched into a smile as sharp as glass. "Well, well," she said loudly. "Seems Helen Dawson's got herself company at last. A pity it took savages to keep her warm." The words cut deeper than the wind. Helen kept her chin high, but her throat burned. Sheriff Harlan Pike strode from his office, his presence commanding the street like a drawn gun. He looked from Helen to the two men, his jaw setting hard. "What's this, Miss Dawson? You harboring strays?" His tone was a warning. "They need medicine," Helen said, her voice steady. "That's all." Pike's eyes narrowed. "Medicine leads to trouble when given to the wrong kind. You'd do well to remember that." Newell did not speak. But when Pike stepped closer, his gaze lifted to meet the sheriff's. Dark, unwavering, it carried no threat, yet held a quiet strength that was more unsettling than any raised voice. Pike faltered, spat on the snow, and turned away with a mutter. Inside the mercantile, the judgment grew heavier. Helen's request for herbs was met with narrowed eyes. She felt their stares on her back, each glance accusing her of sins unspoken. On the way out, Martha's voice chased her. "Careful, Helen. Folks already think you're touched by a curse. Take in wild men, and no decent soul will come near you again." Helen's steps faltered. Then she felt Newell's presence beside her. His shadow fell across hers. When she glanced sideways, his eyes were steady, unreadable, yet anchoring. She lifted her chin and walked on. Back at the cabin, she brewed the herbs while Newell split logs. The rhythm of the axe echoed like a heartbeat. As dusk fell, Helen spooned the bitter tea into Whitefeather's cup. He sipped it, then his body went rigid. A low groan escaped his lips. His breath hitched, turning into a rattling cough. Newell was at his side in an instant, his face a mask of stone. He gently took the cup from Helen's hand and tasted it. His eyes shot to hers, and for the first time she saw something other than calm in them. It was a cold, sharp fury. "This is not for a fever," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you mean?" Helen whispered, her heart turning to ice. Newell dipped his finger in the dregs of the cup and brought it to his nose. He looked at the herbs she had bought. Then he looked at his father, whose breathing was now a painful struggle. "These herbs, they do not heal," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "They make the poison work faster." Poison. The word hung in the air, cold and deadly. The sheriff's warning wasn't about prejudice. It was a threat. He didn't want them gone. He wanted them dead. And Helen had just delivered the weapon. The silence in the cabin turned sharp, brittle. The herbs from town weren't medicine. They were a death sentence. Helen stared at the herbs scattered on the table, then at Whitefeather, whose breath was a shallow rasp. "Poison?" she whispered, the word tasting like ash. Newell nodded once, his face carved from stone. He grabbed a handful of snow from outside and pressed it into a cloth, bathing his father's brow. "An old poison," he said, his voice a low growl. "Slow. Makes it look like the sickness of winter." Helen's mind reeled. The sheriff's visit, Martha's taunts. It wasn't just petty cruelty. It was a calculated trap. They hadn't just stumbled into a town that hated them. They had stumbled into a town with something to hide. "But why?" she breathed. "What did you see?" Newell's dark eyes met hers. "We saw a wagon, tracks leading away from the old silver mine, the one that's supposed to be collapsed. The old Sterling mine. It had been abandoned for years, a place of ghosts and bad memories. Pike's men," Newell continued. "They were hauling something out. Not silver, something else. They saw us watching from the ridge. Suddenly it all made sense. The town's fear wasn't about her. It was about what these two men represented, witnesses, and the sheriff was cleaning up loose ends." That night, Helen didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, watching Whitefeather fight for every breath. Newell sat across from her, his silence a heavy, watchful thing. They were no longer just strangers sharing a roof. They were allies in a war they hadn't chosen. A few days later, Sheriff Pike rode up again. This time, he wasn't smiling. "Cutter," he said, his voice sharp. "A federal marshal came through town, asking questions about a payroll robbery up north a few months back. Said a few scouts went missing, Apache scouts working for the army. Their bodies were never found." "Wait, wrong story. Let's correct." Pike's voice cut through the cold air. "Heard your visitor is feeling poorly, Miss Dawson. A shame. Sometimes the mountain just decides who belongs and who doesn't." The threat was naked now, stripped of all pretense. Helen stood in the doorway, blocking his view. "He's resting." "Is he now?" Pike swung down from his horse. "I've got questions for him, about where he's been." He took a step toward the door. Before Helen could move, Newell was there. He didn't touch the sheriff, didn't speak a word. He just stood in the doorway, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and will. Pike's eyes narrowed. He looked from Newell's cold, defiant face to the rifle on his own saddle. For a long moment, the world hung in the balance. Then Pike laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Have it your way. But when he dies, you bring the body to town. The law requires it." He swung back into his saddle and rode away, leaving a chilling promise in his wake. He wasn't just waiting for Whitefeather to die. He was going to make sure of it. That night, as the fire burned low, Whitefeather stirred. His eyes, though clouded with pain, were sharp. He beckoned Helen closer. His voice was a mere whisper, a dry rustle of leaves. "The curse," he rasped, his gaze fixed on her face. "The fire. It was no accident." Helen froze, her blood turning to ice. The fire that had taken her parents, the one that had branded her an outcast for life. "You have your father's eyes," Whitefeather whispered. "John Dawson was a good man, too honest for this valley. Her father's name, on the lips of this dying stranger. The foundation of her lonely world cracked open. Pike." Whitefeather breathed, his strength failing. He wanted the land, the water rights. Your father wouldn't sell. His eyes closed. "The map. Newell has the map." His voice trailed off into a rattling cough. Helen stared at Newell, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was no longer just a stranger. He was a link to her stolen past. And the map he carried wasn't to some hidden treasure. It was proof of murder. The town hadn't just cursed her. They had buried a secret beneath the ashes of her childhood, and she had been living on top of a grave. The revelation hit Helen like a physical blow. The fire, her parents' death, the town's shunning. It wasn't a curse. It was a conspiracy. Sheriff Pike hadn't just been a bully. He was a murderer. She looked at Newell, who met her gaze with a deep, somber understanding. He reached into the leather pouch at his side and pulled out a rolled piece of hide. It wasn't a map of trails. It was a property deed, drawn by hand, with the signature of a federal agent and the thumbprints of 3 Apache elders, including Whitefeather. It granted water and timber rights on the northern slope to her father, John Dawson, in exchange for his help surveying the territory years ago. The land Pike had tried to buy, the land he had killed for, was legally hers. "My father knew," Newell said, his voice low. "He served as a scout with the agent who signed this. He knew your father was an honest man. When we heard of the fire, of the orphan girl left behind, he wanted to find you, to give you this. But they had been driven south by their enemies, and years had passed, until now." "Pike wants this deed," Helen whispered, her fingers tracing the faded ink. "That's what they were looking for. That's why he poisoned your father." The pieces of her life rearranged themselves into a new, terrifying picture. She wasn't an outcast. She was a threat. The next few days were a blur of grief and grim preparation. They buried Whitefeather on the hill behind the cabin, next to the unmarked graves of Helen's parents. Newell built a simple marker of river stones. There were no prayers, only a shared, silent vow of justice. The town was waiting. They could feel it. The silence from the valley was heavy, watchful. Pike was letting them grieve. He was letting them think they were safe. He was giving them enough rope to hang themselves. "He'll come back," Helen said one night, staring into the fire. "He won't let us leave this valley alive with that deed." "Then we do not leave," Newell said. He was cleaning his father's old rifle, his movements steady and precise. "We make him come to us." The breaking point came on a dawn brittle with ice. Helen rose to find the cabin surrounded. Pike had returned, this time with a posse of 10 men, their rifles gleaming cold in the early light. "This ends now, Helen May," Pike's voice boomed across the snow. "Give us the Apache and the papers he stole, and we'll let you walk away." It was a lie. They all knew it. Newell stepped out into the pale light, his father's rifle in his hand. He didn't raise it. He just stood there, a lone warrior against a wall of guns. Helen's heart seized. She remembered his father, kneeling in the snow, choosing restraint over violence. But Newell was not his father. He was a son with a blood debt to pay. Before he could make a move, Helen stepped out beside him. She held no weapon. She held the deed. "This land is mine, Harlan Pike," she called out, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "My father's name is on this deed, and his blood is on your hands." A murmur went through the posse. Some of the men had known John Dawson. They'd respected him. Pike's face turned dark with rage. "Lies. She's mad. The curse twisted her mind." "There was no curse." Helen's voice soared, cutting through the cold air. "There was only your greed. You burned my home. You murdered my family. And you used this town's fear to cover your tracks." She held up the deed, the names and signatures visible in the morning light. "This is the truth. Are you going to die for his lies?" The men looked at each other, then at Pike. The story of the cursed Dawsons had been a foundation of their town for a decade. But Helen's words, spoken with such raw, undeniable conviction, shook that foundation to its core. Pike saw his power crumbling. With a roar of fury, he raised his rifle and fired, not at Newell, at Helen. Newell moved like lightning. He threw himself in front of her, the bullet meant for her, tearing into his shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall, his own rifle coming up. His shot was true. It took Pike in the chest, knocking him from his saddle. The posse froze, stunned. The sheriff lay in the snow, his reign of terror over. In the silence that followed, one of the older ranchers, a man who had known Helen's father, swung down from his horse. He walked over, picked up the deed, and read it. He looked at Pike's body, then at Helen and the wounded Apache warrior standing beside her. His face was grim. "She's telling the truth," he said to the others. "This deed is real." The fight was over. Justice, it turned out, had been waiting under the snow all along. The valley thawed, and so did the hearts of the people in Dry Creek. The truth, once revealed, washed away the years of fear and suspicion. Pike's crimes, and the complicity of men like Martha's brother, came to light. Helen Mae Dawson was no longer the cursed woman. She was the heir to the Dawson Ranch, a woman who had faced down a murderer and reclaimed her name. She didn't do it alone. Newell stayed. His father was buried on her land, and now his roots were here too. The wound in his shoulder healed, but the bond between them, forged in fire and loss, was permanent. They didn't speak of love, not in words. Their language was in the shared work of rebuilding. They mended the fences of her father's ranch together. They cleared the fields. They turned a house of ghosts into a home. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house. "My father said this land holds the spirits of good people," Newell said quietly. Helen leaned her head on his shoulder. "It does now," she whispered. They had faced the storm and found each other in the quiet aftermath. Two outcasts who had discovered that home wasn't a place you were given, but a place you fought for, side by side. What do you think makes a person truly belong? Is it the place they are born or the choices they make? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming next.